So during today's video we are going to talk about the adrenal glands, and you can see here in the image that you have got your kidneys, and that sitting above the kidney, on top of each kidney, I've only drawn one here for speed, but you can see sitting above this you have got the adrenal gland, and you should be familiar with this from the beginning of this module when you looked at the endocrine gland. So that was in 5.4.1a. So in this particular specification, point 5.1.4b, we want to look at the adrenal gland. We want to look at the sort of histology of it, so the different parts of tissue that make up this gland. And in relation to that, we then want to look at the different hormones that are secreted by it. So we're going to look at it in sort of quite some detail today. One of the things before we start to sort of go into the detail here, I just wanted to sort of take you back, and this is a bit of sort of further information here, but I think it helps you to understand the two different components of your, or two different tissue types of your adrenal gland, is to state that actually if you go back to embryology and you look at how this tissue came to be, you'll see that actually in terms of embryology it developed from two different germ layers, and therefore we've got two distinct types of tissue. Now one of those is very much of endocrine tissue and the other one is very neuronal. And in terms of the hormones, when we look at the hormones, we see hormones then secreted which are, some of them go on to stimulate and the secretion of other hormones, and then we also then see secretions that are causing sort of very much sort of neuronal type activity changes. And that's what we need to sort of detail today. So we need to look at this, we need to look at how this particular gland is stimulated to make its secretions, and we also then need to look at the action of those. Now, the two different parts that we are going to look at, okay, so we've got two parts today that we need to look at. The first of these is our cortex, and the second is the medulla. Now, if we look at those two different parts, we actually see the secretion of two different hormone types. So if you are not on top of your types of hormone, you really need to make sure before you do this, you do look at the different types of hormone. We're going to see both steroid-based hormones being secreted today and also protein-based. So you need to be able to differentiate between these, and in particular you need to understand the different ways in which they're going to interact with the cell surface membrane. So actually, to start our journey today, we need to start by looking at the brain, and we need to do this because we need to highlight a particular gland here which is responsible for stimulating your adrenal glands. And you see this marked in green initially. So here I have got the pituitary gland. And what I've done is I've shown this below so you can actually see an enlarged version of this, because in what we're looking at today, we actually want to look at the anterior pituitary gland in particular. And this part of the gland initially, when it comes to stimulating the adrenal gland, is going to be stimulated by a hormone that comes from the hypothalamus sitting just above the pituitary gland. So what we're going to see is we're going to see a hormone which comes and it stimulates your anterior pituitary. Okay, so here we're anterior, and we have something called corticotrophin releasing hormone. It's sometimes known as corticotropin releasing factor, so we can abbreviate that here to CRH or CRF, dependent on your preference. I've always referred to it as factor, so that's sort of my default to go to. I will just write this above for you so that you have that there. So cortico, okay, so cortico, and then you've got tropin, and it is releasing factor. And what that does is it stimulates the anterior pituitary, so we need to come down here, to release a hormone which is called adrenocorticotrophic hormone. So adreno, and that's an adreno, okay, meaning relating to the adrenal gland. Then you've got your cortico, and that means it's relating to the cortex of the adrenal gland. And then we have got tropic, and what that means is it's actually going to stimulate the adrenal gland to then secrete hormones itself. So a number of different hormones are going to be secreted as a result. Now this one is often referred to as ACTH. Okay, so this is the start of our journeys. We start at the brain, we start with the hypothalamus. Now, what we have missed at the beginning here is, well, why is this going to be stimulated? And there's sort of a number of different things here. And these all ultimately relate to stress. So it could be something that you've heard, so a sound that's causing this. It could be something that you've seen, so an image. Or it could be sort of stress, sort of a stressor to the body itself. So these are all things that are going to stimulate that hypothalamus and then therefore your pituitary gland to release your ACTH. Now ACTH is then going to stimulate your adrenal gland, so we need to now sort of connect this up. So we're going to take this ACTH and we're going to take this to the adrenal gland here. Now, there are a number of different impacts that this can then have on your adrenal gland, and it depends on the sort of part of the cortex that it stimulates. So each different part of the cortex actually secretes a slightly different hormone, and we need to talk about all of those. So what you can see here is an enlargement of a sort of cross-section through the adrenal gland, or one of the adrenal glands. And you can see that initially I have labelled sort of two distinct sections of this tissue. So we have the cortex, which as I have said already, this particular part of the pituitary gland is going to, of the adrenal gland is going to be controlled by the pituitary gland. And we then have the medulla, and this part of this tissue is neuronal tissue. It's actually your post-ganglionic neurons. So in actual fact, if we looked at this tissue, we have got neurons which are sort of like travelling down into this tissue, and we can see the axon terminals terminating in this tissue and then causing their secretions. And if we look at what those secretions are that we see from your medulla, then here we are looking at peptide-based hormones, which are here, so that we can write that these are peptide-based. And you've got two core hormones that you need to be aware of here. So you have got adrenaline, and you have also got noradrenaline. So if we just touch base briefly upon what these hormones do, if we take our adrenaline to start with, this particular hormone is going to be responsible for increasing heart rate, and it's also going to play a key role with regards to metabolism, as it's going to increase the blood glucose levels. And we looked at an example in class where we saw how this could interact with the cell surface membrane in order for it to sort of signal for changes and signal for these changes in metabolism to take place. With regards to noradrenaline here, again, we're going to see an increase in the heart rate, but we're also now going to see dilation of pupils, and we're going to see the vasoconstriction of the your blood vessels, which are going to your non-essential organs. So we're just going to put sort of divert blood. So I now want to come to the 3 different tissue types that you find in the cortex. Now, I have noted these down. You don't need to actually be able to refer to each of these tissue types, but I think it does just help us to sort of articulate the different hormones and where these are coming from. So we look at the first layer. The first layer is called the glomerulosa. And this particular layer is going to be responsible for producing mineralocorticoids. And then finally you have your reticularis, and the reticularis is going to be producing your gonadocorticoids, and these are often referred to as androgens. So these are precursors to some of your sex hormones. So one thing I just wanted to point out here is effectively we have a number of prefixes. So we have mineralo, we have gluco, and we have gonado. And if you look at these are going to help you to unpack what each of these things do. So mineralo, if we look at this one, we're looking at our water and salt balance. So here we can talk about water and salt. If you look at gluco, that's going to be relating to sugar. So we're looking at our metabolism. And then gonado, you're relating to the gonads, so the sex organs. And here, so you've got your precursors to these sex hormones. The second part to unpack with this is the fact that they've all got the corticoid. So the corticoid part means that here we've got a steroid-based hormone, and that means that this is going to be able to directly interact with your cell surface membrane, so it can go through your cell surface membrane. Now, as these can diffuse straight through your cell surface membrane, this means that these are going to then be able to go straight through into the nucleus, and they can then change the transcription of genes from the nucleus. So we can look briefly at the interaction between your steroid and also your peptide-based hormones here with regards to your cell surface membrane. So if we look at this diagram that I have drawn here, you can see actually both pathways. So we start with the steroid, where we have just looked at those corticoid hormones. You can see here on the left hand side, we can see here an example of one of these hormones. And this is just going to pass directly through your cell surface membrane. Now, once it does this, you can see that it's then going to form a complex with a receptor protein that is inside of the cell. And that hormone receptor complex can then pass through the nuclear pore, and it can move into the nucleus. And it's then going to bind with our DNA, as you can see here, and that's going to then activate the transcription of the gene. And so what we would see is that we would then see the building of a protein. So we'd initially see the putting together of a polypeptide chain, which can then go on to fold into a protein. So if we then look at one of the hormones from the medulla, so for instance adrenaline, which is a peptide hormone, we can see here a very different pathway which is taking place. So you can see that we initially have the adrenaline as a hormone binding with a receptor embedded into the cell surface membrane, and this is referred to as our primary messenger. So this is actually a G protein. And we can see that once this peptide hormone has bound to this, we'll see a conformational change in that protein. So its tertiary structure will change, and what that does is it activates then a second G protein in order to also change its conformational shape, and we'll see the phosphorylation of GDP into GTP. Now, GTP is then going to activate your adenylyl cyclase, which you can see there at the top in green, and the activation of this is going to cause your adenylyl cyclase to itself undergo a conformational change, and that then enables the synthesis of CAMP. So we have the ATP to CAMP using these molecules. Now, CAMP stands for cyclic adenomyophosphate. So this has one phosphate molecule, and this is going to be really important because this is now going to go on to act as a secondary messenger within this cascade of events. So as a secondary messenger, our CAMP is then going to activate protein kinase, and it's going to cause a conformational change within that protein. Now, activated protein kinase phosphorylates other molecules, and in this particular case it's going to phosphorylate glycogen synthase and glycogen phosphorylase, and these are going to cause two different things here. So with phosphorylation of your glycogen synthase, it inactivates it, and what that does is it inactivates the synthesis of our glycogen, so glycogenesis. It also, as I just said, phosphorylates glycogen phosphorylase, and this actually activates it. Now what this is going to do is it's going to promote your breakdown of glycogen, so glycogenolysis, and there's also a role here in activating your gluconeogenesis. There is a further enzyme here that I haven't mentioned, but that one, once it's been phosphorylated, is going to activate your gluconeogenesis, so the generation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. Okay, so just to summarise what we have looked at today, we have looked at the adrenal glands, and in particular we have looked at the stress responses. One of the first things that we mentioned here was this interaction between your hypothalamus and your pituitary gland, and that's a really sort of important interaction that's happening here. So you have your sense organs, those are going to be picking up information such as sounds, images, and that will send information to your brain, in particular your amygdala, which is your emotional centre of the brain, and that's then going to stimulate your hypothalamus, and that's going to happen via the sympathetic part of your nervous system. Now the hypothalamus is then going to stimulate, again using sympathetic neurons, both your adrenal medulla and your adrenal cortex, and we noted that that happens in two different ways. So if we look at the activation of the adrenal cortex, we see what is referred to as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and that refers to the fact that you've got the hypothalamus, which is then going to activate the anterior pituitary to secrete your ACTH, and ACTH is then going to go on to cause a secretion of mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids and gonadocorticoids. Now what we didn't say previously was the different hormones that this includes. So with your mineralocorticoids, as we said, these are going to control your water and your salt balance. Actually, these are going to go straight to your kidneys, and they're going to cause your sodium to be sort of actively put into your blood, and that's going to then draw water, and as a result that's going to increase your blood pressure, which is something that you're going to need so that you can pump more blood around in a fight or flight situation. Then with your glucocorticoids, you have cortisol, which regulates your metabolism and also regulates your blood pressure, and you have corticosterone, which works with your cortisol to regulate your immune response, and in particular it suppresses inflammatory reactions. From here, we moved on to have a look at how these different types of hormones, so you've got your peptide-based coming from your medulla, which was very much neuronal pathway stimulation, and then we had our steroid hormones in coming from our cortex, how those interacted with the cells in order that we could recognise the different types of cell signalling we see here. So we see the steroid hormones able to directly interact with the cell surface membrane, forming a complex with a receptor protein inside of the cell, and then altering the transcription and therefore resulting in translation and production of proteins. And then we saw the peptide base, which had to have a primary messenger to take that message across the cell surface membrane, and then we see this sort of cascade of events leading to ultimately a secondary messenger activating protein kinase, which then goes on to phosphorylate and lead to your regulation, in this case as it was your adrenaline here, which is going to then be able to affect your metabolism and stop the production of glycogen and promote the breakdown of glycogen.